We're about halfway through November, and since about 2003, the charity Movember has used this month to raise awareness and funding related to men's health issues. So, since 2003, they've actually funded over 1,250 men's health projects around the world. The main issues they've been targeting in recent years, though, are men's mental health and suicide prevention, prostate cancer, and testicular cancer. So the campaign this year is focused pretty specifically around mental health, or kind of given more emphasis to it than they have in previous years. And what they're trying to do is encourage men to go beyond small talk and carve out space for more meaningful conversations. So I realized that I had never really talked to you kind of specifically about mental health and kind of your own experience managing your mental health and your physical health as a man. So I thought it would be important, especially as we're seeing a serious impact of the pandemic that we're facing on mental health and men's mental health. So I thought it would be a good time to have this conversation and hopefully reduce some of the stigma around mental health for men and demonstrate some of the importance of men's health. So they're calling these moments for Movember. So I thought it'd be nice if we had a little moment together.
Yeah, and we talked about this, I don't know, probably about a week ago now. And you asked me if I'd be willing to do it, and I was. I mean, obviously, I do Movember, and I have for the last 3 years, I think. And for me, I think it's an important charity for a couple of things, and we'll get into more of those details, I think, as we're talking. But yeah, I think as a guy, it's hard sometimes to have those open discussions because it just does not fall into the realm of usual behavior for men. And I think Movember is doing a good job. And obviously the funds raised are awesome. But for me, one of the reasons I've embraced Movember is the awareness they create, and sometimes you can only do that when you have a big public-facing charity drive like Movember does. And the fact that it's such a visible way of showing your support, whether you're growing a mustache or going full beard or that, I think the whole point that I really like is just the awareness it's creating about problems that often aren't talked about very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's awesome, especially with mental health, that just that awareness does make such a huge difference as well, and especially for people of different age groups. So I kind of wanted to start generally by asking you what mental health means to you.
Well, mental health is such a complex subject to talk about. And it's one that until recently, certainly when I was growing up, was treated very differently than it is now. And I think, again, that introduces a challenge for people of a certain age, my age, in how we deal with questions of mental health. And I think we are heading in the right direction, but obviously we still have a long ways to go. But if I was to say what mental health meant to me, I think it's really just, are you in the mental place to enjoy life, to have a useful life, and to be able to relate to those you love and the world around you in a healthy way? We are in a very unusual time right now, where I think all those safety buffers that we typically rely on to keep our mental health kind of on track have been depleted. We just don't have a lot of mechanisms that we come to rely on for happiness in that in our lives right now. And that's why, for me particularly, this Movember was important to maybe focus more on the mental health side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. When you talk about kind of those buffers that you typically have for mental health, kind of in normal circumstances, what are some of those things for you?
Well, obviously family, you know, and immediate family, but also extended family.
Mm-hmm.
Having those person to person contacts, but really, I think just face to face contact with people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I really think that's important for us to have that social give and take, and for a lot of us, that's been restricted. The ability to just have to do the things we like to do and to enjoy ourselves. It seems like we've lost the ability to do a lot of those everyday things, whether it's travel or going out for dinner or getting together with friends for drinks, or
Mm-hmm.
we've had a lot of those things taken. Going to a gym and exercising. Those are all things that I think help keep us on track. And in a lot of cases, we don't have those anymore. So I think this year in particular has really caused us to dig deeper. And I think one of the dangers of that is maybe we just are ignoring some of the danger signs that could be indicating that we are having trouble processing this new reality.
Mm-hmm.
And things may be creeping up on us, and we may be losing our cool where we never did before over things that normally we could take in stride and it wouldn't be a big deal.
Mm-hmm. So without having those buffers there, you kind of have less patience to deal with other things, and kind of stuff that wasn't as stressful before feels a bit more stressful now.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about too is, you kind of, when you stop exercising the social interaction muscle, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you kind of get out of practice. And so just dealing with other people, um, if we do that all the time, if we're always going to restaurants and stores and things, you're constantly interacting with people, and your social skills are a little bit honed, but we can now go days without talking to anyone outside our household. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we kind of lose the ability to communicate effectively with people. So you also lose that reinforcing kind of energy that you get from those social interactions. We're just not doing it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, I find now when you have to have small talk with someone, kind of forget how to small talk at the moment
Yeah.
when you're not doing it all the time.
Well, and for us, and we've talked about this, we're both tend to be introverts, and so
Mm-hmm.
that adds a whole different dimension to it too, right? Like, when you think of that social and mental energy you get from interactions, um,
Mm-hmm.
that's another variable that's thrown into the mix.
Do you think, like, because you're more introverted, that not having those social connections has been easier or harder than if you were more extroverted?
I think it's a bit of both, right? And certainly there has been talk about, well, are introverts having an easier time of this because they tend to spend a lot of time by themselves anyway? Is this hitting extroverts harder?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I think it's just different. I don't think it's easier for anyone or harder for anyone. I think it's just different. Introverts need social interaction too. We just generally look for a different type of social interaction than an extrovert might, right?
Mm-hmm.
We love to have conversations, but about real things, meaningful things, things that interest us, and not being able to do that as much, is going to have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's harder for one than the other. I think it's just it's equally hard, but just in different ways.
Mm-hmm. While we're talking kind of about the impact of the pandemic right now, have you had many conversations with other men right now about how it's impacting them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Back in March and April, when this first started, I did reach out to a few friends I had in various places. In a lot of cases, people that were kind of similar to me, where they were also kind of introverted and they were also, shared my same kind of ideals and beliefs about certain things. And I reached out to them, and generally everybody was coping.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of an interesting word to do. It means you're not really thriving, you're just getting by, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be fair to say is people were coping. But the other thing that I think was kind of interesting is whether it's just the platform we were communicating on, whether it was just a phone call or something like this, where it was a Zoom call or something. It was kind of hard to dig much below the surface. It was pretty hard to get to much more than small talk. And, I think guys, first of all, guys are just horrible at doing that at the best of times. Like, it's just not something we're particularly good at. And if we do it, it's generally over a couple of beers in a face-to-face setting, right?
Yeah.
And not having that ability to do that, I think, made it harder as well. As things kind of went on, I did that less and less. And I've had a couple of people call me just to check in and see how I'm doing. I've got a couple of close acquaintances that I've probably kept in touch with. But when I say keep in touch with, I'm thinking maybe I'll call once a month or once every 6 weeks. It's just not something that we tend to do a lot of.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. Something that we've talked about before too is about kind of men and how their circle of friends kind of serves a little bit of a different function than sometimes that it does for women. Whereas like women use it more sometimes for like social support as well. So if you were struggling, is that something that you would necessarily go to other men in your life for, or would you kind of lean more on a partner or a family member for that?
So with my friends, probably not. Anytime guys to get together, the topic of conversation is never about our own feelings. It's about something else. And if our own feelings do come up, it's almost embarrassing, right? Like, guys don't know how to process that. Mm-hmm. So, when guys chat, it's about anything other than how we're feeling about stuff. Mm-hmm. So for me to pick up a friend, the phone and call a friend and say, hey, I'd really like to have a deep, meaningful discussion about, my emotional state or my mental state right now. It would just be weird on both mm-hmm. ends. Not to say it's wrong. It would just, the reality would be, it would be weird. It would be weird on my end to do that, and it would be weird on the receiving end of that call.
Yeah.
But then, if you're turning to family or, family or loved ones, that's a whole different ballgame, because when you're a dad, and I do think of myself as a pretty typical dad, your role in the family generally doesn't leave yourself open to admitting that you're struggling. Mm-hmm. You're kind of the guy that is somewhat foundational in a different way for the family, right? So, mm-hmm. Again, there's not a lot of places for people to turn to, for guys to turn to talk about this stuff. And sometimes it's just a lot easier to broach this stuff with a relative stranger than to talk about it to someone who you're closer to. Mm-hmm.
Right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not so much the men that you're friends with. It's just the types of relationships that you have. It's nothing against the people that are in your life.
Generally, my friends are all 4 guys, again, pretty sensitive, caring people. That's who I try to be, and generally I surround myself. So it's certainly not a comment on the nature of the people who are my friends. Is just this kind of social restraint.
Yeah.
I think around having those kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm. So kind of how those relationships have been constructed over time. That's not really a norm to share feelings in that way.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So I think like we can definitely talk more about the pandemic, but I think while we're talking about how those relationships are constructed, it'd be interesting to kind of look at you growing up and how relationships with men and kind of how you were taught to act as you were growing up in other socially constructed ways, kind of exploring that a bit. So can you tell me about like how mental health was talked about as you were growing up and kind of how what types of things shaped that opinion?
Well, first of all, it wasn't. It wasn't talked about ever. So, you have to understand the context I was growing up in. First of all, I was born in 61, so I grew up largely through the 60s and 70s. I grew up in rural Alberta, which is a very conservative place. And men were expected to be tough. They were expected to be strong. They were not supposed to be wimps. They were not supposed to admit weakness in any way. I grew up in cowboy country, right? Like that's what they, whether right or wrong, that's what guys were supposed to be, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly growing up in that environment, you would never talk about your feelings. Like mm-hmm. That just wasn't accepted. And I think the other thing was we didn't in turn have that relationship, or I didn't anyway, with our own parents. Like it was kind of this model that was passed on from generation to generation. You got to be tough. You got to suck it up. You got to work hard. You got to do these things. You got to be the main support for your family. That, again, that was the cultural construct I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And so you were surrounded with this kind of expectation of what it meant to be a strong guy. Mm-hmm. And discussion about mental health was just not part of it. You sucked it up, you bottled it up, you pushed the feelings down, and you just kept slogging through. And that's just how it was. And I don't know if culturally or ethnically that's different. I mean, I grew up in a very English, my both sides of my family came from England, and the English are not known for being typically emotive or emotional. So, it was just not something that wasn't a place you went to. It wasn't what you did. Mm-hmm. And, I think the other thing was growing up, mental health issues were hidden away, right? Mm-hmm. Like there was mental health hospitals that everyone was sent off to, right? And as kids, we used to, make jokes about it. Like, mm-hmm. if you were all acting at all out of the norm, there was horrible things that the kids said to each other. Yeah. And a lot of them revolved around mental health and created the stigma that I think then got passed on, or that we live with. And speaking for myself, I still am spending a lot of time trying to unlearn those things, to re-educate myself and to convince myself that discussion about mental health is a healthy thing. It's a vital thing, and we need to start doing that. But that was mm-hmm. definitely not where I came from as a kid.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that experience is not unique to you. Like, I'm sure there's lots of people that have experienced some aspect of either being raised in kind of an English family where within the family it's not talked about, or kind of that macho man kind of lifestyle that's in the rural areas that's really common there. So that might be why we see kind of generationally it's pretty common to have that idea around mental health unless something shifts it. Right.
Yeah. And in a lot of cases, I think that shift may come from personal experience. If you suddenly are to a point where it can't be pushed down, it can't be bottled up, it can't be hidden, it can't be ignored, and you're faced to deal with it, then that starts to break down some of the walls that you've built around it. and then maybe you become more open to discussing it. But certainly I think for a lot of people of my generation and my gender, it's probably still a very difficult subject to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. One thing you said earlier was that sometimes it feels more comfortable to talk to a stranger than a circle of friends if you're experiencing an issue. How were you kind of brought up with the idea of seeing a counselor or going to psychotherapy? Was that something that was ever brought forward?
Not really. I think later in my life, at least one of my parents did have counseling. And I think for me, I had to get past the point of me thinking that was a sign of weakness to me actually thinking that was a healthy and a positive step. And I will admit, it took me a while to kind of get over that. I think that's probably true for most people that I grew up with in my kind of generation. Going to a counselor was a sign that you couldn't cope anymore and you just weren't cutting it. And I'm hoping that's changing, but again, that's a re-education and a relearning process that I'm personally still kind of going through.
And do you think that barrier, not wanting to do that as a sign of weakness, is stronger for men?
I would guess so. I would suspect so. Yeah, again, there's all these kind of gender expectations, I think, right or wrong. And I think that does create a bigger barrier to entry for men than it might for women. And I'm just speaking anecdotally on that.
Just kind of in your circles of people that you've talked to. So I think definitely one thing I remember kind of growing up is that you were pretty involved with the business. So you ran a company for several years. Did that kind of impact your relationship with your mental health?
Certainly it was stressful. I think in generally speaking, it was positive stress more than it was negative stress. I think I came to, it was always very challenging, but challenging in a good way. And I always loved that challenge. And I was very fortunate to work in an industry that I loved. And there was far more positives than negatives that came with that. We certainly had our bad days, sometimes bad weeks, occasionally bad months in running the business. But I think there was more good than bad. But again, it put me in a role where I was the guy in charge. I was the guy that people depended on. I had to be consistent. I had to be, I had to be on. And again, when you're that guy, it becomes tough to kind of step back far enough to say, I'm struggling here and I need help. And I think if you are in a career path that relies on you to be consistent and reliable and all these things, then that's just one more barrier to accessing help when you need it.
Definitely. Just kind of those multiple roles that you're in that expect you to be strong and other people relying on you.
It was literally reinforced every time I turned around a corner. Gord, you got to be the guy. You got to be there. You can't have an off day. You can't have a down day. That's a lot to juggle.
Yeah. How do you think that kind of set the tone for mental health for your own employees and for people within your company?
In hindsight, we could have done so much more. In hindsight, we could have we could have brought the conversation out in the open. And I regret that we didn't do that more. I regret that we didn't create a safer space for people to have those conversations, and I take full responsibility for that. I mean, certainly, my business partner is very much like I am. We're both of English background. We both don't admit feelings, and if we were different people, maybe we would have been a little more forward thinking in making mental health more of a priority within our company. But there's so much more we could have done, and in hindsight, I wish we would have done that now.
Yeah, at the time that you had the company, it wasn't necessarily as common, I think, as it is now for companies to kind of take mental health on as a company priority.
Yeah, I think that's true. It certainly wasn't an expectation that was communicated within our business circles. And unfortunately, the business I was in, which was online marketing, and that we have had within the industry circles, I know mental health has been an issue. There has been a number of suicides within our circle of acquaintances I've had. Where mental health was obviously a struggle, and in a lot of cases we had no idea. We just didn't know that was the case. So I'm so glad that we're starting to break down those barriers and have these conversations, because mental health is every bit as important as our physical health, but it really, in terms of priority, it has not been a priority. Like, I've lived almost 60 years of my life either ignoring it or not dealing with it in a prioritized way. So I'm definitely glad those things are changing.
Yeah, I think we're all trying to do a little bit better, but I think it definitely makes us proud when we see our parents trying to make changes in that way as well.
Yeah. Well, we're trying. We're trying.
Everyone's trying their best. So we've been talking mainly about mental health, and you kind of just referred to how we do need to look at mental health as much as physical health. But Movember also does advocate for kind of men's overall health. And statistically, we know that globally, men die on average 6 years earlier than women for reasons that are largely preventable. So one of their things they're trying to do is kind of make men a little bit more proactive in managing their own health. So what kind of has been your experience, or maybe some challenges you've faced managing your own health as a man?
Yeah. So again, we talked about this a week ago, and I personally had a health challenge that I have not talked about to a lot of people. And, we talked about whether we should go there in this conversation. And I got to the place where I went, yeah, I think it's important to have this conversation, especially when we're talking about Movember, but also when we're talking about mental health, because I think it's all part of something that is all interconnected. So almost exactly 6 years ago now, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I was lucky in that I had a very good prognosis. It was very treatable. I ended up having brachytherapy. I had to remind myself of the name there for a bit. And I'm now 5 years cancer free. But I didn't tell a lot of people about that. In fact, other than kind of an immediate circle of very close family and friends, I chose not to. And there was various reasons for that. One of those reasons was my mother actually got a cancer diagnosis at about the same time, and hers was not nearly as hopeful as mine was. And I didn't. The focus needed to be on her, not me. And I had a very hopeful path and a very actionable path. And I thought, you know what, I can get through this. But I think me making that decision kind of reinforces everything we've just talked about. I got to be the guy. I got to be the support guy. I got to be there for my mom. I do not want this diagnosis to define me. And that was, I mean, those are probably the altruistic reasons of why I chose not to tell people. But I think, to be 100% honest with myself, it was easier for me to push that off and kind of focus on other issues that were external to me. And that was probably not me being very honest with myself. Anyone with a diagnosis of cancer that comes with a lot of mental baggage that you need to process through. And again, I thought, oh, you know what? I got a good prognosis. Certainly the local healthcare facility or the local healthcare community made me aware of support services if I needed them. I chose not to take advantage of that. And I think that was wrong. Again, looking at my own mental health journey, I was dealing with a lot of things at that particular time. I was dealing with, first of all, my own diagnosis. I was dealing with my mom's diagnosis. I had recently retired from the company, so I was no longer that guy in charge. And I was, one of the mental health issues that I don't think people a lot talk about is when a guy who has been in a career path for a long, long time, and that career path begins to define him, when you step away from that, that's a huge mental journey to take. So I was processing that at the same time. So I kind of had all these things I was dealing with, and I chose not to reach out for help. But something interesting happened. So, I went through my treatment. The treatment was kind of a one-shot deal. I went in, I had my brachytherapy. There was no real follow-up required. There was no chemo. There was none of that required. There was no hormone treatments that I required. So it was kind of a one and done type deal. I had follow-ups with my oncologist, but they were kind of, you go in, you'd have your PSA checked, have a prostate exam, always a fun thing to look forward to. But that was it. And then I'd kind of go on my merry way. And I started kind of wondering, well, I'm pretty sore. It's pretty uncomfortable. I seem to be dealing with stuff. It's not clearing up as quickly as I thought it would be. And certainly with those types of medical issues for a guy, again, that's a whole mental thing to package. Like, you're talking about the things which, being pig-headed males, we think kind of define us, right? And so, to admit that you're having issues kind of goes against everything that you think guys should be, that should, virility and masculinity. And it wasn't until we were actually buying a secondhand holiday trailer. And we went to see this trailer, and an older gentleman was the one selling it. And I had just had my treatment, so I had to be close to a bathroom literally every 5 minutes. And we were in a parking lot looking at this trailer, and I really had to go to the bathroom, and I had to go now. And so I finally said to the guy, I said, look, I'm so sorry, but can we go to your house and use your washroom? And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. So he walked back with me, and he waited. Well, I did what I had to do. And then I came out, and he said, are you having issues? I said, well, I haven't told a lot of people, but I had prostate cancer, and I actually just had my treatment a few months ago. And he goes, said, I thought so. He said, I had mine a year ago.
Wow.
He said, I recognized that. And I had the most useful conversation with this complete stranger.
Wow.
For the next 5 minutes about, He's going, don't worry about this. This is normal. Here's what you to expect. That one conversation probably did more for me to know that I wasn't weak and I wasn't, and sometimes that's what a stranger can do. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why when we talked about doing this, I said, no, I think we need to talk about everything, because if I can be that someone to someone else, if somebody can turn to me and go, I didn't know you went through this, but if you don't mind, like, let's have a phone call, or let's just talk. If I can be that, if I can give that gift to someone else, that's a gift I would like to give.
I think that's so important. I didn't know about that story. It's very interesting. Also kind of strange that he asked you about your bathroom habits, but I think it's really.
I'll tell you, when you've gone through that procedure, bathroom habits become paramount. They are your highest priority for a good period of time after.
For sure. But interesting that it took kind of a chance situation to find someone that had that shared experience, where if maybe you had reached out to some of those supports, that would have been available right from the start. So that's awesome that you got it eventually.
Well, and for me, understand too, like I said, my prognosis was very positive, right?
Yeah.
Like they said right from the beginning, this is very treatable, and we don't usually use the word cure when we talk about cancer, but in your case, we can actually use that word.
Yeah.
And so part of me feels like I had just won the lottery, and I felt, well, it wasn't really fair of me to go to a support group where a lot of people may have not had nearly as positive a prognosis, and me kind of going, oh, well, look at poor me, I'm dealing with stuff too. I mean, It's pretty hard when your biggest problems are you successfully sold a company, you are now in retirement, you just you've got diagnosed with cancer, but you've got a great prognosis. It's pretty hard to you think there's something wrong with you when you go, well, I feel sorry for myself. And again, now that we've talked about my background, it's not really unusual, I guess, for me to feel that way, but you just don't feel like, you feel like you would be taking advantage of the situation if you went to a support group. Or the other thing is, you may not want to hear all the not so positive stories that everyone else in that support group. You're also dealing with fear. That's another thing. I mean, the doctor said everything looks really good, but what if I'm that 1% or that 0.5% where, it doesn't go as well as they thought? So there's a lot of stuff you deal with.
So, what did it feel like, or what does it currently feel like to know that you had cancer, but you don't really kind of feel like you are able to say that you had cancer?
Well, ironically, I think it's easier for me to say that now. I've probably shared the fact that I did have cancer, and I guess I can use past tense now. I feel like I can share that now because I don't think it will define me anymore. It's something I've had. It's something that helped me, that created more awareness of those particular types of cancer and how prevalent they are in men. And that was certainly a reason why I did Movember in the first place. But it's to me, it's almost like saying I had mumps, or I had shingles, or I had something else kind of in the past, and that no longer is who I am. But it has given me experience, and if that experience is helpful to someone else, then I think I've got to the place now where I'm feeling more comfortable in being open about that and talking about that.
So how would you say that experience shaped your mental health, kind of coming out the other side of that?
I think a lot of this was processed in hindsight. A lot of this is me kind of going, I should have done that. I don't know, to be honest, if it's made me more likely to look for help in the future. I hope it has.
Mhm.
But knowing myself, I can't guarantee that I would be. I'm still emotionally, I think there are still barriers for me reaching out for help as quickly as I think I should.
Mhm.
And they're not as high or not as imposing as they once were, but they're still there. So
Mhm.
as far as mental health, um, have I completed that journey? Am I in a absolutely 100% place? Probably not. I'm a lot further down that road than I was. I don't know if I've left all the baggage behind that was put on me both by society and gender expectations and all
Mhm.
those other things when it comes to questions around mental health. I think I'm still dragging a lot of that baggage with me.
That's
Hopefully things like this will help push me forward too, right?
mhm.
To start having conversations about this stuff.
Definitely. And I think, like you said, awareness is where it starts, and conversations are where it starts. So you kind of said that you're still on your own journey, but with your asking for help, do you think you're more likely to be that guy that's selling a trailer and offers another guy a hand, or is willing to kind of provide that comfort to another guy now?
Yeah, I hope I'm that guy. I've been waiting for an opportunity to be that guy. It hasn't come yet, and maybe I should be more active in looking for it. Maybe I should put myself in situations where that's more common. And certainly, I think that's part of me is deciding, well, I'm still relatively young. What are the things I still want to do in the rest of my life? And I
Mm-hmm.
think being that guy that just says, hey, let's talk about your bathroom habits. No, but talking about if I can be in a situation where I can help others, I think I want to be that guy.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it almost sounds like you would be more comfortable asking someone about their bathroom habits than about their emotions and their mental health?
Ooh, how perceptive of you.
Which
Um,
might be a little bit backwards, but kind of based on our conversation, I think makes sense.
yeah, you know what? That's probably true. What a sad comment that is.
I feel like that's like men would feel more comfortable asking each other about why they're running to the bathroom than if they think they might be struggling.
As a guy, I would say that's probably 100% true.
Interesting. Well, hopefully this helps in changing that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there I think part of your journey like with that as well, talking about the prostate cancer, like how because I think one thing that's pretty common right now is we're letting a lot of health things slide during the pandemic. How did going for like regular screenings and early detection really help with your treatment and your recovery?
So, two things that I'm thankful for there. One is I have a wife that pushes me to go to those doctor's appointments. And you know what? If it hadn't been for her, I probably wouldn't have gone nearly as often as I did. Um, Two, I had a doctor that took the time. My PSA, she would always insist I had a PSA, which, oh my God, everybody, every male,
Mm-hmm.
when you get to that point where you're a candidate for screening, do it,
Mm-hmm.
because that's how mine showed up. And it showed up early enough that the prognosis was good and it was treatable. But I also had a doctor who kind of said, look, this is borderline. I'm a little concerned about it. I wouldn't mind exploring it further and investigating it further. And I kind of agreed with that. And so we were a little more aggressive in following up on it than, it it could have been very easy for me to say, well, let's leave it for another 6 months or a year, and just ignore it. And I, thank goodness, chose not to do that. So yeah, as you said, men live on an average, 6 years less than women, their life expectancy. And I remember reading somewhere that the primary cause for that is guys are much more reluctant to go to the doctor for regular checkups. And again, it's just this stupid pig-headed maleness. Like we just do not want to appear weak. It's much easier for us to ignore things. And we really got to get over that. And I am absolutely part of that camp. I tend to ignore things. I tend to push them off. I tend to say, oh, it'll get better. It's nothing, I can deal with it. And that's just not healthy. It's not good. We've got to stop doing that.
Mm-hmm. I think it'd be, especially for men who don't necessarily have a partner at the moment, the only people that kind of push them to go and do that stuff is either their family or other men in their lives. So it's good, I think, if you can kind of help each other through that as well.
Yeah, and I would, again, speaking anecdotally, I think it would be unusual for men to push men to go to the doctor.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It's just, again, it's not a conversation we generally have. It certainly can happen, and I'm sure it does happen. I just think it's less likely to happen between two guys.
That makes sense. So kind of talking about this, what's one thing that you would say, or a piece of advice you would give maybe to someone that's just been diagnosed and is just kind of starting that journey, just found out that they have prostate cancer?
I think finding someone you can talk to who can share that life experience with you is important. There's certainly the Cancer Society in your area. Will have, almost guaranteed, will have a prostate cancer support group, or can certainly point you in the direction of resources. So yeah, find those people and have a conversation, and no matter what your prognosis is, even if you're like me and you have a very positive prognosis, you're still going to be dealing with some stuff. You're still going to have to process some stuff. You're still going to have to wrap your mind around the fact that you were diagnosed with cancer. And that's not an easy thing, right? So, go try it once. And if it's not for you, well, that's fine, but at least give it a try. With my situation, which might be common, because there was no ongoing treatment cycle after, generally a lot of the support that the Cancer Foundation or the Cancer Society would provide tends to be more geared towards that kind of ongoing treatment, right? If someone's actively going through radiation treatment or chemo, if it's a kind of a one and done thing like mine was, first of all, you're dealing with healthcare providers that kind of specialize in that particular thing.
Right.
Either it's a surgeon and you have your prostate removed, or in my case, it was, somebody who specialized in brachytherapy, and they kind of take that, okay, you're good now. Everything's been done. But mental issues don't kind of go on the same timeline. They don't heal on the same timeline that physical issues do, right? And so sometimes you don't have the same opportunities for support that somebody who is on a longer term treatment cycle would have.
Right.
So you might have to show more initiative on your part to look for those resources and seek them out. But they're absolutely there. You just need to find them. If you're not as comfortable with a formalized, kind of official support. If you do have friends, male friends, you might be surprised. Have a chat with them. I mean, I'm not unique. There are a lot of people out there who had issues, health issues, generally related to things like prostate or testicular, that chose not to talk about them because they felt it would make them less of a man. But if you start having open conversations, I think you'll be surprised at how many people actually have shared life experiences and may be able to be helpful. Right?
Yeah, you might be surprised at how many people are out there that were just waiting for someone to open the door and are ready to have that conversation. So you've kind of talked about this kind of throughout, but what was kind of the main thing in deciding to talk about it now?
I think we just talked about it, right? I think we just mentioned it. If people know, if I'm out and if I can come out and say, look, I did have to deal with prostate cancer. I did have to deal with some of the mental fallout from that. If I can be of help to you, talk to me. I'm certainly willing to share my experience, and if that helps you, if that can help you process this easier, or know that you're not unique, you're not weak, you're not a failure as a man because you're processing these things, that's good. That's a desirable outcome. So I think that was one thing when you kind of forced me to think about this. It was probably a process that was long overdue. I probably should have done this earlier, but I guess better late than never.
Exactly. And I think November is a great time to do it.
Yeah.